The HIV antibody test is a very bad test. I believe that it is one of the worst frauds committed on the American public in the century. Well, just about everybody believes that if you get one of these tests, it will actually tell you whether or not you are infected with HIV, and if it's positive, that that's some kind of a prediction of whether or not you'll get AIDS. And that is absolutely not true. First of all, a positive result on that test doesn't mean that you're infected with HIV, and there is no way that it can mean that. There's a basic scientific principle that most people are totally ignoring, and right now I'm talking about the scientists and the doctors who are advocating these tests. The people that say these tests are 100% accurate. I would say more that they're 0% accurate. And the reason for that is this test contains what you call antigens. They are proteins from the HIV, the virus. And the principle of it is that the HIV proteins in the test kit are supposed to react with any kind of HIV antibodies that may be present in the person's blood sample. So the HIV antigens would react with the HIV antibodies. And theoretically, only HIV antibodies react with HIV antigens. Now, in reality, what really happens with antigens and antibodies is that they're not exclusive with each other. They're more promiscuous. In other words, antibodies will react with antigens that they don't belong to. In other words, let's say I have tuberculosis, and I have antibodies to the tuberculosis organism in my body, and I go out and take an HIV antibody test. What might happen is that my tuberculosis antibodies will cross-react with the antigens to HIV in the test kit, thereby giving a false positive. And these kind of cross-reactions are very, very common and very, very predictable as far as HIV antibody tests go.
We get a lot of cross-reacting. For instance, if you've recently had a flu jab, you're told not to have an antibody test because you might come up positive. 41% of patients with multiple sclerosis in one study tested positive for HIV. 12% of people with generalized warts. If you live in an area where tuberculosis or leprosy or malaria are endemic, you could come up positive for HIV even though you don't have HIV. So there's so many different variables as to what might give a positive reading. I don't believe that any test has ever yet given absolutely specific HIV antibody results or reactions.
You can test positive because normal body proteins like actin and mycosin react with the test. You can test positive for all sorts of strange reasons, and that will go on your medical records, and your doctor will look very sorrowfully at you and said, "You have just tested positive for the AIDS virus. You are going to die."
Now, it's a deadly thing to tell somebody when they have a head full of 10 years of the imagery of AIDS that they are now HIV positive and in a risk group for developing AIDS, in the risk group for developing AIDS, because HIV positivity is built into the definition of AIDS.
And HIV positive means antibody positive. It doesn't mean that you've got the virus. On the contrary, it means exactly the reverse, and hence you should be protected and not predisposed towards getting the disease.
That's the whole purpose of vaccination, to give you an immune response to the virus in the form of antibodies that would be measured on an antibody test. So it's really ridiculous to say to people that because you test positive on these tests that you're going to get AIDS and you're going to die prematurely. It just doesn't make sense.
The Western blot really is, the main difference between that and the ELISA is that in the ELISA you have the HIV proteins just globbed up into a big mixture or a big soup. And in the Western blot they separate all the proteins out onto a strip, and each protein is on its own separate little band. And the criteria for the Western blot are that you have to have a certain number of these bands react positive. There are three main proteins of HIV, and they would like you to react positive to those major ones, but sometimes if the minor ones are positive, that can help you out if you want to be positive. The problem with the Western blot, and there are many, is not only that it is susceptible to the same flaws that cause cross reactions on the ELISA, but that is not reproducible and it's not standardized. It is possible to test positive or negative on the same Western blot done on the same blood specimen depending on what test kit you use, whether it's from a different manufacturer, what day of the week you go in, what lab you go to, or even what country you live in.
Now, the Western blot is considered the more specific of the two tests because it uses 10 proteins to detect antibodies, whereas the ELISAs conventionally use 2 or 3. Western blot uses 10. You can get a positive Western blot in Africa that would not be considered positive in Australia. You can get a positive, by official, this is official guidelines, you can get a positive Western blot in Britain that is far more specific than a positive Western blot for the largest gay men's study, HIV and AIDS, the MAX study in America. In the MAX study in America, on the Western blot, which American viewers will know is essential to HIV-positive diagnosis, you required only one strong antibody band out of a possible 10 in order to be called positive. In Britain, that is insufficient. So we're in a situation where even on the most specific test, it matters what country you got tested in. So is this absurd?
I have a chart here that will show you that one of the best ways to change from positive to negative is simply to change your residence to a different country. This was published in Continuum magazine from London. It was made up by Val Turner, a scientist in Australia who has done a lot of work on HIV antibody tests. And he has pointed out that there are different criteria for reading these tests. And each one of these columns shows the different criteria from different countries or places. Now, as you can see, going from one column to the next, there are different criteria. Without looking real closely, you can see it's pretty obvious. In Africa, all you need is 2 of these bands to be positive. In Australia, you need 4. In the United States, we have 5 different sets of criteria for reading Western blots, and they are all totally different. So if you go to a lab that uses the American Red Cross criteria, you may be positive. And if you go to a lab that uses the FDA criteria, you may be negative. And if you go to a lab that uses the CDC criteria, you will more likely be positive there because they use much more lax criteria. Now, this is totally ridiculous. How can you say that somebody is infected with HIV or not, depending on whether they live in the United States or in Australia? It's totally absurd.
What are the different antigens and antibodies and conditions will cause a false positive reading?
Well, like I said, we have hepatitis B, and we have herpes simplex, which is a very common condition. There must be millions of people in the United States infected with that. And flu, or a flu vaccination will do it, and even the common cold. Now, this would be a very rare chance if that would happen, but it is a possibility. And in countries like Africa, where it's supposed to be riddled with AIDS, or in Southeast Asia or India, where we are supposed to have these new up-and-coming heterosexual AIDS epidemics, what's really happening there is that there are such huge amounts of endemic tuberculosis and malaria and hepatitis B, and all of those things cross-react on the tests, that's what's happening. When people are tested in those regions, it is very easy for a cross-reaction to take place. And there are other things, such as alcoholic hepatitis, the connective tissue disorders such as lupus or mixed connective tissue disorder, or rheumatoid arthritis, and there are a lot of people that have that. And the methods of the viral load papers